You know, the use of the term post-pandemic may sound too optimistic in these days of vaccine shortages and new strains of the virus continuing to emerge on continent after continent. But we know that addressing and transforming today's conditions is precisely how we will construct our post-pandemic world. This is the moment to thread our pragmatic work with idealism, an opportunity to reimagine not the world as it was before all the damage was wrought, but a world much more closely aligned with our beliefs in equity and opportunity. To help us understand how we can move toward this goal, you will hear from an extraordinary group of experts who will provide the global growth context for 2021, as rich and poor nations alike deal with the pandemic's fallout. Then we will turn to look at the country that is home to more than half of the Amazonian rainforest, with an economy critical to understanding the strategies necessary for stability and growth: Brazil. Not long ago, this nation, with its enormous number of small and medium-sized businesses, was on track to become one of the top 5 economies in the world. But today, Brazil seems to have lost its way in trying to achieve economic growth, poverty alleviation, and more equal distribution of income. Progress toward these lofty goals, once seemingly
Então,
within reach for Brazil,
depois de um período de sucesso, teve um reverso e o, o país entrou em recessão e o Brasil está quase por perder mais uma década de crescimento.
of the 1980s. How can we mitigate that outcome? The economists I will introduce in the second half of this afternoon's program will explore the issue for the case of Brazil and also help us draw lessons for other emerging economies in Latin America and elsewhere, which find themselves struggling with similar circumstances. But before we turn to our speakers, I would like to remind our audience that questions can be submitted in the Q&A chat field, which we will address during the Q&A period after the speaker discussion. I also want to remind you that simultaneous translation is available in Portuguese. Now, I'd like to turn to introducing Jan Svechnar, a colleague and friend at Columbia University. Jan is the James T. Shotwell Professor of Global Political Economy and Director of the Center on Global Economic Governance at Columbia University. His research has included understanding the effects of government policies on firms, labor, and capital markets, as well as tackling entrepreneurship and investment. Jan was honored with the 2015 IZA Prize in Labor Economics from the Institute for the Study of Labor. In 2008, he was one of 2 presidential candidates in the Czech Republic. Prior to joining Columbia, Jan taught at the University of Michigan. Jan, I'd like to turn to you for opening remarks, after which I would introduce our first panelist, Professor Jacob Liu. Over to you, Jan.
Thank you very much, Safwan. And let me start by congratulating you on directing the Columbia Global Centers. Indeed, it's a pleasure to see how well they are doing. And indeed, today we're cooperating with the Rio Center, with which the Center on Global Economic Governance has had a fruitful collaboration for several years. So this is indeed a continuation of a wonderful long-term cooperation. I should mention we also work with, of course, the Beijing Center, the Paris Center, and other centers. So it's a real pleasure. Thank you, Safwan. Let me welcome you on behalf of both the School of International and Public Affairs, which, as you know, is one of the truly premier schools in this area, probably the most international one in terms of number of students and professors who come from various countries around the world. And so indeed, tackling global issues has been on the forefront of SIPA's compass. And 9 years ago, we launched the Center on Global Economic Governance. We have dozens of faculty members from Columbia, number of external collaborators who worked with the center and continue to work with the center. We involve graduates and undergraduate students in various...
envolvendo alunos de graduação, pós-graduação, e de fato é um centro global e muito exitoso, e é um prazer patrocinar essa série. Então, sejam bem-vindos e espero que aproveitem. Muito obrigado.
For success with the Center on Global Economic Governance. So I'm really delighted that we have this partnership. going, and we will do great things together. So thank you, Jan. And next, what I would like to do is introduce Jacob Liu. Jacob, or Jack, is a visiting professor at Columbia School of International Public Affairs. He was confirmed by the United States Senate on February 27, 2013, to serve under President Obama as the 76th Secretary of the Treasury. And Jack, I cannot but punctuate this introduction by saying that I am so glad that we're back in that zeitgeist. Jack served in that position until January 2017, the last day of the Obama presidency. Before that, he had served as the White House Chief of Staff, and he was director of the Office of Management and Budget, a position he also held in President Clinton's cabinet from 1998 to 2001. Jack first joined the Obama administration as Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources. Jack, I look forward to hearing your remarks, and during today's discussion, we'll be especially curious to learn your thoughts on the newly confirmed United States Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, if you feel comfortable doing that. So over to you, Jack.
Well, thank you, Safwan and Jan, and to everyone for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to be with you today. It's too long since I've been in Brazil, and even though I'm sitting here in the same room I sit every day, I feel a little bit like it's a chance to visit again. I think that if you look at where the economy in the United States and globally stand today, it's never, in my experience, been more closely linked to the quality or lack of quality of policy response. We're in an economic condition that's fundamentally shaped by a health crisis. And our ability to respond to the health crisis has had everything to do with the trajectory of economic recovery. There were problems in the US and the global economy before the pandemic. There will be lingering problems that are worse, I believe, after the pandemic. And the question in terms of policy is how quickly we emerge and can repair that damage. Obviously, the United States and Brazil share the ignominious distinction of not having had a great policy response to the COVID crisis. You can see that reflected in the lost work days, the lost school days, the interruptions of both economic activity and life. The success in the United States has been the development of a vaccine. Again, the failure has been distribution of the vaccine. Policy, science did well. Execution of policy did poorly so far. I think we're doing a little better now. I think that when one looks at the US economy, when we got out of the hard shutdown, we came back to about where we can be until things are really better on the health front. With the expectation that vaccinations get to a faster pace and normal life can resume sometime in the spring or summer, there's every reason to believe that the second half of the year could actually be quite strong. But the GDP numbers that came out today are a sobering reminder of how hard it is to make up for lost GDP. The strong fourth quarter, relatively strong fourth quarter, still leave a 3.5% hole in GDP over the course of the year, over the course of the pandemic. I'm going to stay with the United States for a moment, just to try and say a few things briefly. Before the pandemic, we had deep challenges in the United States. Overall economic growth wasn't one of them. We'd been growing for 10 years straight. There was no immediate reason to think the economy would go into recession. I think one can say the recession was truly caused by the pandemic. If we now emerge from that pandemic, I think the aggregate numbers will be deceiving because the burden of the pandemic is not being borne equally across all parts of the population. What do I mean by that? I think if you look at where employment has gone down and where it's actually gone up, In the very top end, employment is up. In the very bottom end, employment is down almost 20%. So averages like 6.5% don't tell you the whole story of what's going on in the economy. I think we're going to see relatively normal GDP growth quite a bit before we see true alleviation of the pain of the unemployment caused by the pandemic at the bottom and middle ends of the income spectrum. That act obviously is got social as well as economic ramifications. The good news is I think that the overall GDP position going from 2021 to 2022 should leave us in a position where if we could reach political consensus to how to address some of these
Se a
issues,
gente conseguir consenso político, a gente consegue, de fato, progredir. Só assim. E eu vou voltar a falar sobre isso depois e também falar da economia global e terminar falando um pouquinho sobre os prospectos políticos nos Estados Unidos. Claro, a China não fez bom trabalho nos
the differences in governance actually showed that they had the ability to impose solutions through a more authoritarian means than we would be comfortable with in the United States, but to get the pandemic under control. And it kind of proves the point that the economic conditions will continue to track the health conditions. People are back at work, people are back at school, restaurants are open, not 100%. And Chinese statistics are hard to have a high degree of confidence in, but with roughly 6.5% growth in GDP, one can say that China's a success story at the end, even though they did not do a tremendously good job controlling the early stages of the virus. I look to Europe, and Jan is more expert in this than I am, but as an outside observer, I'm impressed that Europe responded as well as it did in a collective way to a crisis that could not be resolved strictly within the borders of European countries. And I will just note, as an American looking at Europe, the first time to my knowledge since World War II that Europe did that without the prodding of the United States. So Europe comes out, I think, in an odd way, politically stronger and economically stronger, even though they've still got a lot to do. I do business with people in Germany. They're in a hard shutdown right now. That's the heart of the European economy. UK is in a hard shutdown. Whether it's Europe or not, I'll leave to others to define. I think that Europe is experiencing the same thing that we're seeing in the United States. If the pandemic cannot be controlled, whether it's a soft shutdown or a hard shutdown or a modified shutdown, it takes a toll on economic activity. The emerging markets were kind of the back end of the pandemic, partially because of the pace at which exposure to the virus was experienced. I think some of the worst lingering effects of the COVID crisis economically will be in the emerging markets. They have the least capacity to have the kind of robust fiscal response that we've seen in developed economies. The conditions have some pluses and minuses. There's more outdoor life that makes spread a little bit less of an issue. On the other hand, they're much more congested. That makes spread worse of an issue. I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't know net whether the spread issue is better or worse in a lot of the emerging economies, but it's going to mean debt stress on countries that were going into the crisis with a high level of indebtedness. It's going to take a global response to manage that. And I would just note that global response will be in an environment that's different than we've seen in past emerging market crises. The largest single bilateral lender to those economies is China. China doesn't participate in the Paris Club. How China coordinates with the rest of the lender countries is going to be a bigger issue than ever before. You have the unpleasant prospect that if China doesn't participate, others have to choose. Do they participate in a way that ends up making China's debt receive better treatment than it otherwise would, which is not a particularly attractive signal to the global community at a time that I think will demand a considerable amount of generosity. You know, the IMF update shows that they're still showing economic growth for next year. It's actually a little better than they did in their last update, which is a direct reflection of the introduction of the vaccine and the assumption that the return to normal will happen a little bit sooner. The downside risk is vaccination doesn't go well. What I said about spring, summer turns out to be summer, fall, or fall, winter. I can't pretend to know. I do know that where I live in New York, people can't get the vaccine, even though they're technically eligible, more often than they can. If that is the experience across the board, you know, these things will shift out in time. Let me kind of come back to the United States and in a summary way say that, you know, the Fed, along with the ECB, the Bank of Japan, you know, almost every monetary authority that had capacity has used every tool of monetary control to try and, you know, lift up the global economy. That's produced a zero interest rate environment that's led to somewhat incongruous mix of
Levou a mix de condições econômicas melhores, mas com condições de mercado um tanto ruins e também diluídas por conta desse ambiente de taxa de juros zero. Eu acho que o retorno ao crescimento econômico desses mercados nos dá um sinal de que a gente não precisa talvez fazer muito mais. A gente viu isso em dezembro, quando nos primeiros 6 meses de consensos de que precisaria haver uma política fiscal para apoiar a política monetária. E com a eleição do Biden, é bem provável que haja uma resposta fiscal bem incisiva nos Estados Unidos. Ele propôs 1,9 trilhões de dólares de gasto. Eu não acho que tenha um número mágico aí. Os componentes precisam ser levados no sentido de manter a renda das famílias, aquelas que não têm uma renda, lidar também com a distribuição da vacina, lidar com as questões de saúde, questões fiscais e também vários outros problemas centrais que são importantes. Vai haver, sim, um desafio nesse tipo de consenso entre as partes, os partidos. Há a probabilidade de uma conta maior, né, com menos eleitores, né? É mais fácil conseguir 51 votos para um pacote maior do que para um pacote menor. Então, eu acho que a questão é: será um grupo de republicanos que queiram trabalhar com os democratas para chegar a um consenso de fato, para que a gente possa, além de lidar com as questões econômicas, também lidar com essa divisão política tão acirrada, que está tão polarizada nos Estados Unidos? Se houver essa vontade, o presidente Biden, eu acho, vai querer sacrificar um pouco para ter esse estímulo fiscal implementado. E precisa ser feito de forma eficiente. É crítico para se obter mais recursos na economia para poder fazer as coisas voltarem rapidamente. Isso vai acontecer nas próximas 3 ou 4 semanas, eu acho. E para responder à pergunta colocada, o secretário Allen, que é um grande amigo, nós somos bem próximos, e eu devo dizer isso até como um disclaimer, eu acho que nós temos muita sorte de ter um secretário do Tesouro que tem tantas habilidades, até a mais do que um secretário precisa, mais do que até nós já vimos com alguém na posição. Ele tem a especialidade econômica, já geriu esse ambiente político e econômico no Fed. Então, na verdade, ela tem uma liderança muito boa, ela já participou de comunicações nesse palco global, ou seja, tem muita experiência. E ela é também uma professora, né? Ela sabe ouvir muito bem, assim como falar. Ela consegue ajudar as pessoas a entenderem o que eles precisam entender de forma respeitosa. E o objetivo dela é criar pontes, né, entre as pessoas que não se conversam muito. E eu acho que essa habilidade é central, né, mais até do que as habilidades políticas que muitos ali têm. E a gente vai ver, de fato, se esse pacote especial vai, de fato, trazer à tona a mudança que nós esperamos. Mas eu estou muito honrado e muito feliz de ver a confirmação dela e de tudo ter corrido tão bem até aqui. E espero que os desafios que ela vai enfrentar sejam bem colocados. Muito obrigado, professor. A sua apresentação foi ótima.
Only on things in the US and what we should expect in the months and perhaps years to come, but also as far as Europe and the emerging markets are concerned. I find not only great instruction in what you have shared with us, but also a great reason for hope. When we have an opportunity to have a further discussion later on, I'd love to hear your views also on perhaps US leadership. I mean, you spoke about China and China's debt, and you mentioned the IMF, but what opportunities and what needs might be out there for greater cooperation and coordination across various entities in the world? Thank you, Jack. Before I introduce our next panelist, Willem Boter, I will be remiss if I don't acknowledge and thank my close colleague and friend, Tom Trebat, who is the leader of our Rio de Janeiro Global Center, who really put this whole thing together. And we'll be hearing from Tom later on, but I just wanted to acknowledge and introduce you, Tom, in the meantime. So our next panelist is Willem Boter, who is one of the best known economic commentators in the world today. Originally from the Netherlands and educated in the US and the UK, Willem is currently a visiting professor at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and an adjunct senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. Willem was global chief economist at Citigroup from 2010 to 2018 and a special economic advisor at Citigroup from 2018 to 2019. Previously, Willem was chief economist and special counselor to the president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and an original member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. So, Willem, welcome, thank you, and would love to hear your general views and maybe even connect some of what you will say to what we heard from Jack on the outlook for the US and the global economy, and perhaps the main opportunities and risks in the growth outlook for Europe in particular.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I'll start with a survey of where the world economy is and where it's likely to go in the near future. Those data are mainly based on the recently released IMF forecast. They're just a few days old. They were significantly more optimistic than the several weeks old World Bank forecast, incidentally. There'll be some area of disagreement.
Áreas de discordância com o Jack, principalmente no que tange a economia europeia, mas vamos chegar lá daqui a pouco. O PIB contraiu-se em 2020. A meia está mais baixa do que o previsto devido à recessão nas economias e a recuperação na economia chinesa. Mas os mercados emergentes estão piores do que o previsto, e isso é preocupante para o futuro. A economia vai crescer 5% em 2021, em 2022, 4%. As primeiras economias contraíram-se em 4,9% em 2020, em comparação com 3% em 2021, o previsto. A
4% in 2020, and is expected to grow by 5.1% in 2021. The euro area had a dismal minus 7.2% growth rate in 2020. It's expected to grow at 4.2% in 2021, which is not dismal, but given where they come from, it is still a significant underachievement, and 3.6% in 2022. The UK economy, the other main European economy, is even worse in 2020, with a minus 10% growth rate. It's expected to grow at 4.5% this year, and 5% next year. So of the other advanced economies, Japan shrank by 5.1% in 2020. It's expected to grow at 3.1% in 2021. What this means is that none of the advanced economies is likely to be back, even in 2022, at the GDP levels that were forecast in 2019. Right? So we are having a significant output gap across the advanced economies, smallest in the US actually, but significant in Europe. China grew at 2.3% in 2020, after 6% in 2019, and is expected to grow at a spectacular 8.1% rate in 2021, which really would be remarkable if it achieved it. And I think they could well do it, given their willingness apparently to contemplate some greater fiscal support. Emerging markets and developing economies had a pretty mediocre 2020.
Desempenho medíocre em 2020, espera-se um crescimento bastante saudável esse ano, porém, mais uma vez, não vão retornar ao ponto previsto de 2019. Países de baixa renda em desenvolvimento estarão ainda mais baixos e provavelmente enfrentarão um período de déficit, onde será necessária uma reestruturação fiscal significativa. A economia do Brasil contraiu-se 4,4% em 2020. Espera-se um crescimento de 3,3% nesse ano e 2,3% no ano seguinte. Após 1,4%, uma posição medíocre em 2019 e 1,8% em 2018. Quer dizer, o desempenho brasileiro tem sido muito baixo, mesmo antes da pandemia. Essas previsões, esse cenário bem otimista, pressupõe que a vacinação estará bem disseminada durante esse ano. O estímulo fiscal de Biden, por exemplo, a maior parte dele supõe-se que já estará em andamento e os incentivos fiscais japoneses também estariam acontecendo e haverá a próxima geração de fundos da União Europeia sendo utilizados. É um cenário bem otimista com relação ao progresso das campanhas de vacinação, trazendo um crescimento de mais de 6% em 2021. Mas o outro lado da moeda seria a infecção aumentando e o atraso das campanhas de vacinação, não levando a vacinação para os mercados emergentes e países de baixa renda, por exemplo, poderia resultar em uma taxa de crescimento bem mais baixa em 2021. É importante também reconhecer que os residentes de países em desenvolvimento, se continuarem não tendo acesso às intervenções farmacêuticas, se eles ficarem de fora desses avanços trazidos pela indústria farmacêutica e as vacinas, a distribuição das vacinas, se ficarem de fora, então haverá retorno
extremely costly economically, because it would mean a tightening of lockdowns and of the private complement to these public lockdowns. Let me say something very briefly about global asset market responses to what has happened in the past year or so. If we look at risk assets, we find that in the US, there has been no pandemic. Right? It's quite extraordinary. Yes, the Nasdaq Composite, the S&P 500, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average all took a significant beating in Q2 2020, but all three of them recovered quite spectacularly, and despite long overdue despite a slight overdue correction yesterday in all three of these risk markets, they're at near record levels, all of them. And they are at levels where they could have been projected to be prior to this crisis. So in the US, as far as the stock markets are concerned, there has been no pandemic. In Japan, something very similar has happened. If you look at the Nikkei 225, it is again at near record levels. Europe is priced more realistically. The Euro stocks, while it has recovered quite significantly from the massive beating it took in Q2 2020, it is not anywhere near at record levels. And the Euro stocks 50 and 600, neither of them. Brazil, likewise, the Ibovespa index is at generously priced levels. In the US, the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the fiscal response has been little short of staggering. The total fiscal response, should the Biden fiscal stimulus come out of the woodwork, will be, since the beginning of the crisis, little short of 5.2 trillion US dollars. That is a quarter of US annual GDP. That's a fantastic number. Even though it will be spread out over a couple of years, a 12.5% plus fiscal stimulus is a well-timed and well-targeted response to this crisis. I believe that proceeding with a fiscal stimulus of the size that Biden is proposing, 1.9 trillion or thereabouts, is the right thing to do, provided the appropriate monetary support is forthcoming. So in my view, this additional federal fiscal stimulus should be monetized. Thus far, the Fed has done great in terms of monetizing debt and deficits. Since March 2020, the Federal Reserve balance sheet has increased by 70% from 4.2 trillion to over 7.3 trillion US dollars. And it is key that the Fed stands ready further to increase its balance sheet by up to $2.8 trillion, an amount sufficient to monetize the 900 billion Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, the December one, and the 1.9 trillion Biden fiscal stimulus package. It should buy basically all the federal debt issued by the Treasury to fund its latest fiscal ambitions. This would remove any fiscal sustainability and financial crowding out concerns. It could potentially add to inflationary concerns, but I don't think it's time to start worrying about that yet. First, there remains considerable slack in the US economy, so a meaningful inflationary impact from the monetization of the latest two fiscal stimuli is highly unlikely. And second, as and when inflationary impacts might begin to emerge, we are likely to be well into 2022, and we are likely to be in a situation where appropriately designed, careful monetary and fiscal restraint could counter and neutralize any inflationary impulses without sending the economy into recession again. So I think the US is in the right place fiscally. Europe still needs to do more, right? Both on the fiscal and on the monetary side. And emerging markets collectively need to try and do more, but it will be problematic. It will be problematic because they don't have the fiscal space, and they certainly don't have the extraordinary privilege that the US economy has in monetizing its debt and deficits, which is why I think Brazil, despite a quite sizable fiscal stimulus package, has only been able to mitigate to a very limited extent the impact of the COVID crisis. The Brazilian
we'll talk about Brazil quite a bit in the second part of this. Willem, if you don't mind, I mean, let's. Yeah, thank you so much. This was incredibly informative, and I'm tempted as a professor also to tell our audience we're going to quiz them on all the wonderful facts that you have shared with us. But this is great, really great, and very sobering. One of the things that we have when we have such wonderful experts is to keep moving. So I'm going to move to Madeleine and ask Madeleine to round up the first part of this panel discussion before I turn it to Jan to maybe comment and respond to what we have heard, what we will have heard so far. So Madeleine Antonschik is managing partner at Global AI Corporation, a big data and artificial intelligence company. She's also CEO of Global Algorithmic Institute, an AI for Good nonprofit think tank. Madeleine is a senior advisor to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and has held global leadership roles for more than 30 years, first as an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and at Goldman Sachs, Barclays Capital, and Lehman Brothers. Her awards include being named among the 100 most influential people in finance. Madeleine, it's such a privilege to have you with us. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and perhaps one of the things you can comment on, given your expertise in technology, especially in applications of AI, maybe you can share how you see the post-pandemic trend toward increased digitization of many economic processes. Do you see that? And do you see digitization as enhancing equity and fairness? Over to you, Madeline.
Well, thank you very much. But I want to add, my favorite job of my entire career was I was vice president and treasurer of the World Bank, because it was such a rewarding job. And that's sort of the perspective that I've taken in terms of my intervention today. So I will touch a little bit on AI if you'd like, because it is relevant to some of the work that I'm doing to hopefully help EM and DE, emerging market and developing economies. So what I was asked to do, and what I will do, and then I will certainly expand on the AI, is I'm going to focus on what I believe is key to ensuring restoring global economic growth, especially in the EMDEs. And so I'm going to focus on the urgent need for all of us to focus on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm going to begin by just giving a little description of the SDGs, and then talk about the importance of mobilizing capital from the private sector to delivering on those SDGs, and then talk about the market failures that we need to address in order to achieve our shared goals. And clearly AI is a huge feature here, which I will address. So if we can just take a look, if you can share that slide, please. Okay, that looks a little different, but maybe can we just okay. So firstly, what are the SDGs? So many of you likely have seen this SDG rainbow colored symbol, and so you can take it off now because it's a little bit distracting. Great. Yeah, we don't really need that. Okay, so anyway, I just wanted to show you the symbol. Many people have seen the rainbows. And so basically the UN SDGs are a universal call to action established in 2015 by 193 countries. And the purpose is, and the goal is to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. But most importantly, to leave no one behind. So there's 17 SDGs, 169 targets, and 231 unique indicators. And the SDGs focus on the elimination of poverty, hunger, life on land, life underwater, economic growth, as well as environment, social, and governance, so-called ESG issues. But the SDGs are much broader than ESGs, and they address all of the largest macro systemic risks that we face. So now the UN estimates that we need about $2.5 trillion annually to fund the gap that's needed in order to fill and meet the SDG goal by 2030. So it's obvious that the SDGs cannot be achieved by governments or multilateral development banks alone. The private sector has a very critical role in playing in attaining the SDGs. So companies sometimes get overwhelmed. They look at all the targets, the indicators, the SDGs, and they figure, where do I begin with the 169 targets? But what they need to keep in mind is that the SDGs were designed for countries, not companies. So in fact, of the 17 SDGs, only 10 directly apply to companies. Of the 169 targets, only 6 directly apply. And of the 231 unique indicators, only 21 directly apply. And when I say directly apply, I mean that companies could have no control over the other SDGs or indicators or targets because those are really designed for countries. So you can see that the SDGs are very relevant to economic growth in the EMDEs. And I'm going to highlight just 3 as an example. So take SDG 7, clean energy. Climate change is particularly important for EMDEs since they get hit the hardest by catastrophic risk disasters.
Catástrofes nesses países, principalmente em desenvolvimento. Então, o impacto econômico médio, como porcentagem do PIB, é 10 vezes mais alto para um MDE do que economias avançadas. Então, alguns países pequenos já vimos que perderam 100% ou mais de 100% do seu PIB, principalmente em pequenas ilhas, nos países insulares. E o número 13, o ADM 13, proteger o planeta. A grande pandemia de Covid, bom, nós vimos que o desflorestamento causa a pandemia. Grande parte de pandemias e doenças infecciosas são causadas pelo desflorestamento. Isso porque diferentes espécies da vida selvagem fogem das florestas. E assim há patógenos que pulam de uma espécie para outra e dali de espécies animais para humanas. O Covid-19 foi previsto há muitos anos pela Sociedade Zoológica de Londres, num estudo feito em 2002, 2003. Por isso, as empresas não deveriam estar usando produtos de empresas que causam desflorestamento. Quando uma grande empresa foi construída na Indonésia, por exemplo, ou quando uma mina de cobalto é criada ilegalmente numa floresta. Vamos ver o ADM 6, água limpa e saneamento. Lavar as mãos, como sabemos, é a forma mais eficaz de evitar a disseminação de doenças. Mas 45% da população global não tem instalações para lavar as mãos em suas residências, segundo a Unicef. As pessoas vivem nessas situações. Os outros ODMs, zero pobreza, zero fome, educação, igualdade de gênero e assim por diante, são óbvios. Mas eu só queria falar desses 3 grandes ODMs nos quais as empresas têm um impacto importante. Agora vamos falar para outros. Falamos que precisamos do setor privado para que mobilize capital onde ele é mais necessário. O setor privado fornece 9 de 10 empregos de economias em desenvolvimento. E o FMI estima que o setor privado é responsável por mais de 60% do PIB na maior parte dos países. Então, precisamos dos mercados financeiros levando fundos às empresas que estão contribuindo para os desenvolvimentos sustentáveis. Mas o problema é como medir até que ponto a empresa está de fato contribuindo para os ODMs. A falta de transparência é um obstáculo para isso. E é aqui que a inteligência artificial é importante. É aqui que estamos trabalhando. Exatamente, com as Nações Unidas também. Dados. Big Data é importante para alocar o capital ali onde ele é mais necessário. Muitas empresas agora estão relatando cada vez mais sobre sua sustentabilidade. Fora dos Estados Unidos, eu devo dizer, porque nos Estados Unidos nós não fazemos tanto isso. Há muita falta de consistência e dados úteis. Em primeiro lugar, há o que nós chamamos de greenwashing. O Global Sustainability Report é um relatório que tem são em folha papel couché, com fotos lindas, mas o conteúdo fica muito aquém do necessário para que os investidores possam usar esses relatórios.
KPMG recently did a survey, and 63% of the hedge funds that they surveyed said that we cannot invest in ESG because we can't have any reliable data for our investment purposes. So part of the problem also is that there's no agreed standards. One recent study that's out of Harvard had a random sample of just 50 of the Fortune 500 companies. And they found across 50 companies, there are 24 different definitions for reporting on just one sustainability issue, health and human safety. And most reporting still suffers from what we call self-reporting bias. And now here's where big data and AI comes in, because we uncover hidden, unreported risks, especially the risks that are in supply chains. And we show both positive and negative scores. Companies only report they're doing a great job. Obviously, we show, well, actually, quite the contrary is true for many companies. And of course, there's still largely narratives as opposed to useful metrics being reported, largely still binary. Do you have a gender policy? Yes or no? Goldman did a study of S&P 500 companies, and more than half had binary questions and answers. And most importantly, probably, is there's no agreement as to the definition of materiality. Is it financial materiality that matters, or is it what we call double materiality? Many contend that what really is important and companies should report on is what do they believe is financially material for an investor, meaning what the environment does to the company. But obviously, what the company does to the environment is probably more important. And of course, long term, it's important also for the company because they'll go out of business if they, totally destroy the environment. And lastly, of course, as bad as all of these data are, they're not even audited. And so then what happens is we have, I'm sure you may have heard of these so-called raters and rankers, and they try to take all of this information and rate and give a score. And so they, MSCI, Sustainalytics, Robeco-san, and in fact, you may have even heard, Elon Musk complaining about these guys, because what they do is they have information that is totally incomplete and try to impute missing information and then come up with these scores. And so, of course, their models are black boxes, inconsistent across the approaches. And so if you look at the different ratings and rankings, there's absolutely zero correlation across these different providers, even for the same company. So the point is there's a huge market failure in terms of getting capital to where it is needed for the SDGs, and which is crucial for economic growth for the EMDEs. So now there's several initiatives underway to harmonize sustainability reporting, although progress has been slow. So one of which is something that I'm engaged with the UN in, and that is an enormous project where we're using big data and AI to track corporate reporting globally. So what we look at is we scan hundreds of thousands of reports using 60 different languages, using machine learning and natural language processing, and cull through these reports to find what they're reporting, but we also can see using unstructured data.
Mas também usamos dados não estruturados, como chamamos, para ver aquilo que eles efetivamente estão.
For countries to see how well companies are delivering on the SDGs, and then knowing where they need to reallocate capital to where it's needed the most. And also, they need to know where to reallocate capital so that they can achieve their stated goals. This is the first time that countries are using artificial intelligence in national planning. And our data last year was published, and again, it's going to be published very shortly by the UN Secretary General in his annual SDG assessment report. Now, a second goal of this big project that I'm working on with UNCTAD is capacity building and technical assistance in the EMDEs. And this is to bring about a harmonization of reporting standards under some kind of common framework. The IFRS is trying as a second possibility of creating some kind of harmonization. The IFRS is considering whether that it should set up a new sustainability standards board alongside IASB. And they recently had a consultation paper out on sustainability reporting for comment that just closed end of December. So that's still to be determined whether or not something happens on that end. And then lastly, the World Economic Forum, you may have read, they have the International Business Council initiative last year, started working on creating a unified system. They worked all year, and just the other day, they announced that, well, okay, we launched it last year at Davos, and of the 180 IBC members, 60 of them now so far have, quote, embraced the approach, but embracing the approach is far from a unified, consistent agreement to use the approach. And of course, 60 companies out of, the tens of thousands of companies or hundreds of thousands across the globe is kind of a pretty short, shortfall.
Not a big sample.
Exactly. And now I want to touch on one last issue, and that is infrastructure, because this is a huge part of SDGs, and this is a huge part of getting the EMDEs to accelerate their economic growth and create jobs. So firstly, the problem, as everybody always talks about it being a lack of capital, it's not a lack of capital. It's a lack of a pipeline of well-structured projects. So here's where the multilateral banks can help by doing the preparation, designing the projects, doing the environmental and the social assessment impacts, preparing the project agreements and so on. Secondly, market participants are always saying that they need the MDBs to de-risk, and they need bankable deals, meaning, frankly, that they want, AAA credits with, double B yields, which, of course, who wouldn't? But of course, the MDBs do not have that kind of capital to de-risk. They don't. In fact, if you look across all of the MDBs, if you look at their paid-in capital, it's only a couple $100 billion. But what they can do is the MDBs could de-risk the fraud and corruption risk, which, being on the ground, watching what's going on, that could hugely take away a lot of the risk. But of course, we also would need, I believe, some kind of syndication process to de-risk. So for example, reinsurers, something like Lloyd's of London, where these reinsurers are used to enormous tail risk. Now here I want to add, this is one of the unintended consequences of Basel III, one of the capital requirements, because banks used to be lenders in this space, but now because net stable funding ratio and other requirements, they're not able to. So that is another market failure that has to be fixed.
Right.
And then the last issue I want to mention is the asymmetric information. We need a marketplace. We need a marketplace to create an auction process. We need to match the capital providers with the governments and the contracts with the government, contractors with the governments. But then we also need an efficient market making system where the capital providers compete against each other to provide, provide the resources, the funding, and then the contractors can compete each other with the governments. And that way we can actually get a reduction for the governments in terms of the cost of the infrastructure. So again, here's where AI has come into play. My company, Global AI, we built a platform that can be used as a matchmaking system. And we're in the process of rolling this out with UNCTAD. UNCTAD has a World Investor Forum every year. This year it was supposed to be in December at Abu Dhabi, and where they have countries, ministers, heads of state, all presenting what their initiatives are for their economic zones. And so hopefully next year, if it happens, because COVID hopefully is gone, we can roll out this matchmaking and have it some automated and help mobilize capital to the emerging economies. Because to me, without increasing infrastructure, without achieving the SDGs, the emerging and developing economies are continuing to fall behind. So I will leave it there. Thank
you, Madeline. Thank you. Fascinating. And again, it's the problem of riches. So many great experts speaking. Jan, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you to very briefly respond to the three speakers that we've heard from, so that we can move to our next set of speakers focusing on Brazil.
Thank you very much. And I suggest that I provide a brief commentary, but that we don't go into a question and answers now, that we leave the Q&A after we have the second set of speakers. That way we have a kind of complete, if you want, view from the various commentators. So let me just say, as you've seen, and as Safwan has mentioned, this has been a tremendous set of presentations, providing the data, providing the assessment. There is, of course, to some extent, a variation in the sense that I would say Jack provided the upbeat, positive assessment. Willem provided upbeat, somewhat more realistic, and I think Madeline provided the realistic, view of what the problems are, together with a recommendation of remedies. I, actually agree with most of what has been said here. In that sense, I think we've really heard a very good assessment and broad reach here. I think the thing that we obviously should take out from this is that there has been a major shock, okay, that it generated an incredible amount of uncertainty. I'd like to underline the uncertainty that has been, in many, many aspects, from the economic, financial, the health, public health aspect, etc. And that the impact, as Jack and others have stressed, has been uneven, right? Uneven across people, groups of people within countries, and as Madeline was pointing out, across countries as well, right? And so in that sense, I think that's a big challenge, something that really will have to be taken up in a big way. Now from this uncertainty, and the uncertainty that we have sort of at first hand in terms of vaccination in terms of mutations, etc. The question is, could there be really another major downturn, right? Could there be a stock market collapse? Could there be, problem with the mutations and the vaccines not being effective, etc.? In other words, I think we should seriously consider the upside, which appears to be, quite considerable, as well as the possible downside, which hopefully will not happen, but it's always good to be ready. One word that has appeared in our vocabulary much more than before is resilience, right? Before that, we never sort of spoke too much about resilience. Now we do. Adaptation, adaptive leadership, and resilience, right? So that's sort of in the spirit of that. I think that on the global level, it's important to underline what all three speakers, especially the first two, said, that there is sort of unevenness in the sense that economically China is growing, going ahead, moving ahead. US moving sort of second, and Europe being the slowest one, even though, as was pointed out, and I think that's important, is that Europe has achieved a number of things that were surprising how well together it has gone, and the Recovery Resilience Fund, which is about almost $1 trillion, close to €1 billion, is a major endeavor because it's Europe federal sort of approach. It's the first time that Europe is actually going together, where the borrowing is not by individual states, but by European Union, by the European Union as a whole. So I think that's important. Turning to a couple specific things, I think what's very important is that what we see is that investment has gone down. Private sector investment has gone down because of the uncertainty. It's not seen completely in the total numbers because governments, of course, have stepped in and provided some of the investment. But it links to Madeline's point that one needs capital generation from the private sector. And given that there has been a reluctance on the part of the private sector to go into investment because of the uncertainty, there should be some reservoir of possibilities to invest and willingness to invest if indeed the environment and the institutional setup is good. So let me stop here, just making the point that the world, I think, is moving in the right direction. The new administration in the US is definitely pushing in reestablishing the openness, trade. The World Trade Organization is probably going to start functioning again. It was handicapped severely until now. So there are a lot of reasons to be positive, but perhaps we should be watchful that there could be also the downward possible dangers that we should take into account.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you for the excellent summary and insight. So we're going to move over to Jose Shankman, who is the Charles and Lynn Jang Professor of Economics at Columbia, and is also the Theodore A. Wells Class of 29 Professor of Economics Emeritus at Princeton. Jose is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, one of Brazil's most cited economists for his work in many fields, including mathematical economics. Jose, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we're moving to Brazil, and I'll try to make this very short. I'll start with an observation that the period of low growth in Brazil, in fact, is much longer than William was looking at the last few years, but it's really a historical phenomenon. So in 1987, Brazilians and Korean workers produced each 1/3 of US workers' GDP. Now, the Koreans produce 63%, and the Brazilians produce 23% of a US worker. So what you've seen is this tremendous, we're kind of getting behind in this rate for growth, not only against this country that's succeeding growing fast, but even towards the frontier. Right? And so another problem that Brazil has, we have a very high degree of inequality. And I'll talk here today about two causes which I think are important and how we're acting on that, which are education and health. Now, Brazil also has fiscal problems that has been mentioned before. We have a large tax burden for the level of development that Brazil has. But more importantly, we have very distortionary taxes. So every time Brazil collects a dollar, it hurts Brazil GDP much more than other countries when they collect a dollar. So I agree with both Secretary Liu and Willem about what's going on in the rest of the world. I think one thing that economists don't understand, and it's a very important question, why are interest rates so low in the developed country? And even in a country like Brazil, Brazil has experienced, for instance, 10 long real rates, which are, as far as I know, the lowest we've experienced, at least in a long, long time. So what are the challenges for Brazil? When I see, and I'm getting back to these questions I raised about inequality, you know, there's a lost in education, especially for low-income students. This is a phenomenon that exists all over the world, but it's particularly important in Brazil. And there are new demands from the health system. Nobody knows what the consequences of COVID-19, what the consequences in the long term are going to be of COVID-19. Brazil has a history of doing reasonably well in income transfers programs. So if we need to renew an income transfer program, I think we're going to do pretty well. But what I'm arguing here is that Brazil has a very low quality of government services relative to resources. And I'll give you two examples which I think are very important. One is education, and the other connects to some of the things that Madeline spoke about, you know, the question of sewage in Brazil, about provision of sewage. And the final thing I want to talk about, a challenge, is that our immunization policy is a complete disaster. I don't think there's any other words for that. You know, the one thing every economist knows is that when you have a necessary input and there's a lot of uncertainty about supply, what do? You diversify the supply sources and you overbuy, you know, because you don't know which ones are going to work or not. That was a strategy used by almost every country in the question of the vaccine. In the case of Brazil, we did two things. First of all, we ordered a quantity which is very small relative to the population, and there's almost no diversification of sources. The federal government, except for the very small amount of, perhaps for 10% of the Brazilian population, there's some stuff coming from the COVAX facility. Everything else was ordered from AstraZeneca at the federal government. So it's really like you can't do anything more stupid in terms of solution to a problem like this. Now, let me talk a little bit about the two questions. I want to finish my talk today. First, about education. Now, Brazil has a history of spending too little in education. But for the last few years, we've been spending quite a bit. Brazil spends 6.2% of GDP in education. That puts us on the top 10th, 11th percentile of all world economies that the World Bank keeps data for. However, the results are much worse than predicted. If you run a regression of grades on expenditure per capita on students in PPP, Brazil is a big negative outlier. Okay, so we spend much more money than what other countries spend to get to the same achievement, is another way to put it. There's also some evidence that in the past, there were some municipalities in Brazil that got money from royalties from offshore oil. These municipalities spend more money in education, but although they spend more money in education, their achievement of their students was flat. Didn't make any difference between them and the municipalities that had no money. So let me finish by putting a slide. I asked for one slide replaced, and the slide talks about sewage. I don't know, yes, talks about sewage. And what I did, you go to the OECD and you have data from 4 large Latin American economies. Those are the only 4 large Latin American economies for which you have data. So there's data, the first one is Mexico, before Mexico is Colombia, Chile, and then Brazil. And for each of them, I built 2 bars. The blue bar has to do about sewage. The orange bar, which is what I want to talk about first, says how much you collect per capita in taxes in PPP units. So you can compare the different countries, okay? That's the tax collection per capita. I divide by 100 to make it look like something that will fit on the graph, but that's what it is. And what you find out is that Chile, of course, has a much lower tax rates, but it's much richer than Brazil at this point, so they collect more taxes per capita. Mexico is a country which has a higher per capita income, lower taxes, and collects less taxes than Brazil. Colombia, of course, collects much less taxes than Brazil per capita because it's both poorer and lower tax rates. But when you look at what is the percentage of the population whose housing is connected to sewage treatment, you know, whereas Brazil is under 50%, Mexico is way above 60%, between 60 and 70, Colombia is in the 90s, and Chile is in the 100. So even though we collect all these stats, we are incapable of providing the basic services that you know, I think everyone in the population of Brazil deserves. And the fact of the matter is that Brazil, you know, this 50% don't go to 50% of random houses. You can be sure of that, okay? So the 50%, of course, are the 50% poorest Brazilians. So let me finish just by saying that Brazil is going to suffer from the low quality of government services, and getting back, and this situation is going to be worse by current policies. We talk about vaccination, something that Madeline also raised, our inept reaction to the increased interest on climate change, you know, the inept reaction by the government. And while Brazil is a country which has a great story concerning climate change, the words spoken by the government has really made it much more difficult for our Brazilian corporations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jose. We now turn to Lisa Schneller, who is Managing Director for S&P Global Ratings. There, Lisa is lead analyst in sovereign and international public finance ratings for the Americas. She also covers a number of multilateral institutions, such as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the International Development Association. Lisa previously served as S&P Global Ratings Chief Economist for Latin America. She holds a PhD in economics from Yale, and I found it most interesting that she studied under Willem Bolter. So Lisa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Safwan, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel. Thank you, SIPA. And I should also say I was an adjunct professor at SIPA with an associate adjunct with Tom years ago. And I will apologize. I have a commitment. I'll make some remarks and I have to drop off, but I'm certainly available for back and forth at a future date. Picking up on what Jan was highlighting, I like his comment on resilience. I think that when we go to ratings, you know, may not be from always, everyone's from the outside perspective. We don't like to have a lot of volatility in ratings. We don't think that it's serving the investor base appropriately. And if we look at the COVID shock, which has turned everything on its side, from the rating perspective, certainly we've had various changes, downgrades or outlook actions across the ratings scale. And I think that there's a differentiation there in the amount of resilience one can think from the economic strengths inherent in an economy, the fiscal strengths or weaknesses, the institutional strengths. And we kind of view COVID as we viewed it as a one-off shock, and what will be the response of the economies, of the policymakers. And if COVID is exacerbating pre-existing weaknesses, or you don't have a response that we feel is commensurate with kind of the weaknesses. And again, we're saying we're having a view on payment of debt. So it's a very narrow focus. Not is this the better policy prescription? I think that make that distinction. We don't give policy advice. That's where we step in. And if you look at our ratings universe of sovereign ratings of about 135 globally, we have 26 downgrades last year. There are also negative outlook actions. But if you look within those 26, almost 40% or over 40% actually pertain to Latin America. And I think this is underscoring the weaknesses on various fronts across the region. And then if you look at the defaults that have happened last year, 4 of the 6 come from the LATAM region as well. Be Argentina, Ecuador, Belize, and Suriname. I think certainly it was clear Argentina was on the path to default ahead of, given all the policy signaling. But I would say in the other cases, the COVID dynamic exacerbated underpinning weaknesses, pre-existing weaknesses that kind of led to the decision to default. If we're looking forward to 2021, we have 24 negative outlooks, so the risk that a rating could go down. 9 of them are in Latin America. So the region stands out. And the negative pressures really actually span what we call the investment grade as well as the speculative grade space. And we've had actions kind of evenly split across that space if you look back last year. And so I'm going to talk briefly, kind of we can compare kind of what we're thinking about if we look at Mexico, the 3 largest economies in the region, Mexico, Brazil, putting Brazil in this context, as well as with Argentina. And I think stepping back, the actions that we've seen, one of the downgrades we had was Mexico. Argentina defaulted, so there was a downgrade implicit there several times. Brazil's lost its positive outlook, but the rating hasn't changed. Granted, the rating at BB- has captured, includes weaknesses, setbacks, deterioration in the fiscal story and the growth story that we've seen since post the global financial crisis. And if we're one of the key themes that we're looking at, I would want to highlight is we don't just look at debt to GDP. The rating goes beyond that. We actually bring in some of the ESG factors that Madeline was highlighting. We're looking at institutional strengths and weaknesses for sustainable growth, sustainable public policies. We're looking at the economic depth and breadth of the economy. We're looking at the external position, the monetary policy stance, and the point that Willem highlighted, none of these countries, governments have the scope of policy flexibility and de facto that the US has, and particularly given the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar as the world reserve currency. So, what can be the Fed stepping in for the US, it's a different story for the rest of the region, notwithstanding progress that we've seen in terms of monetary policy frameworks and credibility in many countries over the last decade. And then we come to fiscal, right? So I'm just going to put Brazil in the context, comparing it with Mexico and Argentina, and it sits in the middle. And if you look at it when we look at the institutional component, it's also in the middle. In our view, Mexico has a stronger track record of delivering sounder fiscal outcomes. On the other end, at the other end, Argentina has a much weaker track record of delivering solid fiscal outcomes. If we look at the economies, all of them suffer despite kind of differences in levels of per capita GDP, which have more converged, especially given exchange rate fluctuations. They all suffer from growth that, in our opinion, is below that of peers with a similar level of economic development. And if we step back, a big differentiator, LATAM has lagged emerging markets in terms of the hit to the economy because of weaknesses in productivity, education. Many of the points that Jose highlighted for Brazil can be expanded across the region. And it's in stark contrast with the level of dynamism and investment that we see in Asia and the higher growth rates. So, but even within that category, Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina all underperform. And it's not just because of COVID, it's a longer standing trend. And that's a negative for all of them. If we shift to the fiscal stance, Mexico, a lot of criticism from some members of the international community in terms of a lack of a more robust, stronger countercyclical fiscal policy amid the hit from the COVID shock. The authorities have taken a stand that they feel that there's not enough scope there. And indeed, Mexico, with what will be debt to GDP that, yes, has gone up because of hit to the economy to say some 50% of GDP this year, doesn't have, in our opinion, again, what we're looking at as payment of debt on time and in full, has the same scope of flexibility that Peru or Chile has, who start with much lower debt stocks, comparatively speaking, in the region. However, Mexico, its ratings higher. One of the factors is compare it with Brazil's fiscal stance, which we have debt going up, say, instead of going up 8 percentage points, probably going up closer to 20 percentage points of GDP amid the COVID shock. towards the low to mid 70s, the way we look at our calculation of debt. And then we have Argentina, who, notwithstanding a default, has debt about 100% of GDP, thereabouts. And the fiscal positions, you can see the difference in the magnitude of the deficits, Mexico on the low end, but all of them share important fiscal rigidities that are very difficult to tackle and they all have difficulties with income inequality, et cetera. And so this ties back to some of Jose's points, and so we've got to also then look inside the fiscal accounts. Stepping, to the final piece, and I can anchor it into Brazil. Brazil would be much more vulnerable, and it is a speculative grade rating, but if it had a different monetary and an external vulnerability akin to what it had in the early 2000s or the 1990s. It doesn't have the degree of external debt that it had, and it has established a track record of inflation targeting, exchange rate flexibility, et cetera. This has been a key buffer and will remain a key support for its rating compared with, say, in Argentina, which has the composition of its external debt, the order of magnitude, the composition of its fiscal debt and the order of magnitude of the external liability, and then just a lack of credibility on the monetary side. All of these are a bit stronger in Mexico. So that kind of rounds off the comparison. I think a key challenge for Brazil that Ana Paula would be well placed to tackle is, I think, a key aspect moving forward is, can Brazil adjust on its fiscal accounts moving forward? To what degree? And it's not just fiscal, policy is also going to be the growth piece, and that's a key element. That Brazil cannot reduce the kind of debt burden that it has without a stronger growth story. That said, question, can Brazil effectively withdraw the significant policy stimulus that it put in place? That'll be a key factor for its rating. It will, because if not, it could contaminate the financing piece, and we're not potentially the external or the monetary policy piece. We saw after the global financial crisis that the extra quasi-fiscal policy initiatives that were in place were really kept in much longer, and that fed into a dynamic where its rating went lower. So I think that's a key challenge. Can you effectively withdraw while balancing the difficulties of the myriad of implications from on the health side, the poverty and inequality side? So that brings in the politics. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. This was really, really powerful and enlightening. Ana Paula Vescovi, thank you for being so patient. So we're going to turn over to you now, and look forward to hearing your comments from a Brazilian perspective. Ana Paula is chief economist of Banco Santander in Brazil. She's a well-known economic commentator, and she comes from a background 25 years of service to the federal and state government in Brazil, having previously served with great distinction as Executive Secretary of Brazil's Ministry of Finance and Secretary of the National Treasury. She also served as Finance Secretary for the state of Espírito Santo, where she led benchmark fiscal reform efforts. She holds master's degrees in public sector management and the economics of the public sector. Ana Paula, we look forward to hearing from you.
Hey, thank you. Thank you everyone for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. And I start focusing on Brazil matters. Being after José Alexandre and Lisa makes my task easier because I will join the both to talk a little bit about Brazilian challenges. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic has amplified the debate about the role of the state here. Particularly, it met Brazil in a phase of reforms and important change in its political and social perspective, but in a contradictory way. The pandemic is putting in check back those choices because these challenges I mentioned here. The Brazilian citizens want more state, but not necessarily a larger state, but a fairer and more effective one. This necessarily involves a better management and a more efficient use of our so scarce resources. In these words, they expect a higher productivity in public sector, not even in whole economy, but especially in public sector, because we have a big whole of state here in Brazil. Almost 40% of our economy is related to public sector. This necessarily don't spend little in Brazil. We spend badly. With such high inefficiency, Brazilian public service sector, we have a result of inadequate rules and incentives. There is no point in spending more. I have to mark this point here. Brazil cannot spend more money, even in social policy, even in fiscal stimulus and transfer for poor people, because we have bottleneck in terms of our macroeconomic environment. Even if we didn't have such strong fiscal restrictions, we couldn't spend more because we have an efficient way to put in place our social policies, our social programs. The Brazilian state is still hostage in interest groups. Both public and private ones has yet nowadays important role to pressure all its demands over the state, and the Brazilian state is so sensible to this kind of interest groups, pressure groups, and their demands. This condition is seen in the public budget, but also in rules and regulations. For example, Brazil is a very closed economy and has a very low competition. The only solution is a comprehensive reform of the state. Pandemic brought about a strong fiscal deterioration, Lisa said in some terms, and made the current macroeconomic framework insufficient. We have here a fiscal responsibility law, and this law has been diluted over the time, and there is no longer a fiscal surplus target capable of at least to stabilize the public debt. The spending cap rule is a very recent framework approved in 2017 when I was in National Treasury, is no longer enough for a safe fiscal consolidation. And the Brazilian economy has not collapsed due, Lisa have already said, its low external vulnerability. You have a low dependence on external resources for financing both the current account deficit and the public debt over the short and medium term. Additionally, the combination of flexible exchange rate, free capital mobility, and a solid monetary framework allowed the idiosyncratic risks to reveal itself in the price of the domestic assets. I mean, especially the exchange rate and the yield curve. There is no financial repression here in Brazil, and it means that adjustment and relative price has been made, and that another balance was quickly found. However, I see this benefit as a temporary one. Standing still without more reforms, these conditions not to provide a solution. We have a structural macroeconomic problem, which is persistent growth of mandatory spending in the public sector, for example, payroll and pensions, paid to private sector. And we have also a structural microeconomic problem, which is our low productivity, and José Alexandre told very well about this issue. Without reform that attack both bottlenecks, this balance would only become perennial with the return of some financial repression. We have given an important positive signal with the reforms carried out in 2016. After the pension reform last year, mandatory expenses tend to grow 3.5% in real terms per year. Prior to that pension reform, primary expenditures used to grow 6% per year. It's a lot for a country that grows in a long term, some kind of 1.8, 1.5% per year. But discretionary expenses are still highly compressed. The investment, public investment is in its all-time low condition. Here we have a clear picture about the problem for poor public management and an inefficient public sector. It's pointless to increase public expenses if there is no adequate governance to prioritize and to carry out viable projects. Is the pipeline issue, is the pipeline problem. Brazil is currently without a fiscal anchor. The spending cap has been playing an important role since it has established the level of primary spend at 19% of GDP. Since 2016, when we established this spending cap rule, the primary spendings are stabilized in 19% of GDP. Nonetheless, we are close to exhaustion on compression, the discretionary outlays. The spending cap is fundamental, but is not anymore sufficient to adjust the fiscal balance by itself. We need more reforms in terms of reducing mandatory spending. This includes the public budget of subnational entities. Our situation, a last point, our situation is so very different from advanced economy. Okay, we don't have any fiscal space to increase our fiscal stimulus, but we have, in terms of a real interest rate, a condition of 3% a year in real terms. This is almost a double have in terms of potential growth, and our spends grow are rigid and grow faster than this. So it's a clear bottleneck we have to solve. But otherwise, we don't have, I can see a chance of a classic debt default that already happened in the 80s. Last case, Brazilian cannot deal with a kind of a fiscal dominance. It implies that we have the return of inflation and the weakness of our currency after very close establishment, very close reforms, macroeconomic reforms to establish our monetary policy after the implement of inflation targets in framework. But other hand, I can see a tax hike as a solution of our fiscal bottleneck. The leaks are already too large. We have a very big deadweight loss in terms of our tax system. And these leaks led us to elisions, loss of long-term growth output increase, output gap increase, and led us to a higher inefficiency in collection system. The only fiscal consolidation on the revenue side I see would come from tax reform, and it happened because it's possible to have an increase in revenues coming from a higher income elasticity of revenue and lower deadweight loss in terms of tax collection. In the other hand, for my final considerations, inequalities are revealed in the intensification of political polarization here. The repercussions on economy are relevant. And so my big concern in relation to Brazil is which agenda we'll see being discussed in 2021. And if you keep the pace of reforms and conservative view in terms of economic policy.
Thank you, Ana Paula. Thank you. We are over time. We're actually 8 minutes over time. But this has been incredibly rich, incredibly informative. I'm going to ask my colleagues in Rio to forward the questions and the email contacts for the participants who have questions in the Q&A. They come from 2 or 3 people, and they are addressed specifically to individual panelists. So Teresa or somebody in the Rio office will share that information with you individually for the questions that pertain to you, so that you can, if you don't mind, answer them. We've also put in the chat box for all the audience members the names, the titles, the affiliations of all the speakers, and speakers who feel comfortable putting their email addresses can do so in the chat box. I know that Willem has done that. Once again, I mean, I feel like a broken record, but this is an embarrassment of riches. You know, so many great experts, so much to share, so much to cover. And this is only the beginning. As we said, this is the first in a 10-part series. So hopefully over the next 10 events, Jan, we can zero in on many of those issues. But I am going to turn it over to Jan and ask him in 1 minute, maybe, or 2, to respond to our last set of 3 speakers. And my apologies for keeping you beyond the allotted time. So Jan, over to you. You're muted, Jan. Yeah. We can't hear you.
Yes, I'm muted, sorry. Well, I had a dry run. Now, I want to say, look, this doesn't have to be long. As you've all seen, this have been terrific presentations. I think that it was really wonderful to have, starting with the global and then moving to the regional and then to the specific, Brazil in particular. I think we have to thank the participants, all of them, and the second part in particular. I think that it is important to realize that Brazil is a case of a country that has incredible potential. It did manage to realize it a few times in history, right? And it also has managed to not realize, to squander, right? So there's a question that, you know, I think Jose and Ana Paula, et cetera, have, you know, pointed out very clearly is where the problems are. And indeed, the lessons from other countries and the comparison to Korea, for instance, et cetera, is, you know, remarkable. How Brazil could do so much better. And so the region as a whole and Brazil in particular. And I'm glad that we have a Rio Center, Tom. Again, salutes to you and everything you're doing. And together, I think bringing the best and brightest from Brazil and Colombia together for these conferences has been remarkable. And this was a tribute to all of you. And Safwan, again, thanks for keeping it all going at the aggregate level.
Thank you so much. And tomorrow we have our second in this 10-part series, which will be at 9 a.m. New York time. So we hope that many of you will tune in. Can't thank you enough, Jan, for your leadership of this, and Tom and Isabella and Teresa and everybody at the Rio Center, Jose, Ana Paula, Willem, Madeline, and of course, Jack and Lisa, who had to drop off early. Thank you so very much. This has really been fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye.
Very good. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Right.